Thank you, Adam, for the nice introduction. Szanowne koleżanki i koledzy, dziękuję samozliwość wystawienia tutaj, w pięknym Krakowie, na tej zgodzonej uczelni. Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękuję bardzo.
I will speak to you about topic I'm always introduced in English, Laity and Clergy. And I will try to give you some historical lines of development and relationship in the canon law. The development of canon law is a special feature of institutional legal development. The beginnings go back, at the time, biblical time, in which, for example, the first rudiments of a congregational order could be found. Particularly worthy of mention is the structure of offices in the New Testament, the basic features of which have been preserved until to this day. You can find several sources in the New Testament. For example, we have in the letter to the Philippians, in the first chapter, you can find something. Another example of the first attempts and necessities of an order can be found in the exhortations to disputes or grievances of the congregation, as it is described in the first letter to the Corinthians. Naturally, this was not yet promulgated order in the sense of a legal system, of established law, but an obvious beginning of something new in the Christian world. The distinction and significance of clergy and laity appears more topically than ever some 57 years after the conclusion of Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council. So last year it was Pope Francis who, with the motu proprio Spiritus Domini, amended Canon 230, paragraph 1 of the new code. And the original canon, which only considered male lay people for the ministry of rector and acolyte, was changed to the target group of laity. Thus, from this point on, women, very interesting, women are also designated for these specific ministries. And through this act, the Pope gives a good legal framework to what has long been a customary ecclesiastical praxis. Worship functions of women are no longer exception, but an ecclesiastical service by virtue of baptism. Pope Francis is thus responding to a suggestion made, as he writes, in several synods. Most recently, in the final document of the Amazon Synod of 2019, in the Vatican, the wish was formulated under point 95 that in the Church, it's a citation, ministerial offices be entrusted equally to men and women. Equally to men and women. In this document too, this is justified with the dignity acquired in baptism. The dignity acquired in baptism. In view of the current and further changes, it is obvious that we should take a fresh look at the historical development of the legal institution of the clergy, also in distinction to the laity. This presentation will devote particular attention to the clergy, as one clergy in particular, since it is not possible to speak of a legal institution of the laity in the broader sense of the way. To summarize briefly, the laity only acquired a significant role with the Second Vatican Council and subsequently also with the new church legislation in the new Code of 83. Another essential remark should be allowed here. We are, as it were, in the midst of the World Synod of these 2 years, 2021-2023, initiated by Pope Francis on the level of particular churches. and now going onward on the continental level of consultation. At the present time, only the vademecum and the results of our particular churches, the level of the bishops' conferences, are available to us. And incidentally, the reform of the Curia with the recently published Apostolic Constitution, Predicate Evangelium, seems to come in some way to realization. From our point of view, at least, a sound knowledge of the legal developments of the clergy is, I think, helpful in order to better understand the ongoing processes and the future changes, and if necessary, to be able to influence them with professional support. Let's have a look on the early concepts in the early days in the ancient church, in the first centuries of the church. In the people of God, formed by the whole of all the baptized clerics by jus divinum, are differentiated from the simple faithful, the laity. There's a difference. It is interesting to see to what extent this distinction as a social fact was already recognized by the very authority of the Roman pagan empire in the mid of the 3rd century. There are some fountains, and also you can find them in Berio Valerian's first edict of persecution against Christians in the 3rd century, was directly mainly against the clergy, who already appeared as a clearly differentiated group in the eyes of the civil power. And this first edict of the year 257 forbade clerics from performing any act of Christian worship and required bishops, presbyters, and deacons to offer and sacrifice to the old pagan gods. In the following years, there were some other developments like this. And this was a bipartic shame proved insufficient to describe God's people when after a few centuries Europe was evangelized and the Christian society was consolidated. A wise Frankish writer, a little bit later, some centuries later, Rabanus Maurus, describing the social context of the Carolingian age in which he lived, proposed a tripartite division of God's people. And he said, citation, "There are 3 orders in the church," he wrote in his treatise De Institutione Clericorum. He said, "the laity, the monks, and the clerics." And this division, already recognized in the early Middle Ages, continued to be so in later times, that is, to this day. To speak with one German author of history of canon law, with Feine, the universal church began, you can see, to take legal form in the 2nd century. At the time of the Roman Bishop Fabian, the Roman city clergy was composed of a variety of offices: exorcists, doorkeepers, ostiari, acolytes, and the lectorate, which existed before, were part of the city Roman clergy, which consisted of 155 heads. In Rome, under the pontificate of Cornelius in the middle of the 3rd century, the minor orders were already clearly established. The minor orders were not always present, nor in equal measure in all the churches of the world. Subdeacons, acolytes, exorcists, lectors, and ostiaries are mentioned in the Statute Ecclesiae Antiquae, a list composed in Gaul during the 5th century. The decree of Gratian took these figures from Pseudo-Isidorus and Thomas Aquinas, later on made this distinction his own. The ancient minor orders were suppressed after the 2nd Vatican Council. Lectorate and acolytate were restored, but not longer as degrees of the sacrament of order, but as ministries. How could you enter the clergy? In the ancient times, in the early church centuries, one could only enter the clergy in adulthood, and this is the reason for the Pauline norm that excluded from the episcopate, presbyterate, and diaconate. At the beginning, newly converted neophytes aroused a certain diffidence. Also, there was notable exceptions. You can find them in Cyprian of Carthage in the 3rd century and also in Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century. And from the 5th century, you see, when we can already speak of the existence of a Christian society, a new way of access to the clergy became widespread in the Latin West. The promotion of children and young people from families were offered by the parents to clerical service. They gave the children in schools, cathedral and presbyteral schools, they were called. The Second Council of Toledo, in the year 531, offers some interesting information of the regime of these cathedral schools. The pupils who entered as children when they reached the age of 18 had to choose either to abandon the school to contract marriage or to embrace continence in a definitive manner and subsequently receive the subdiaconate and the major orders. So you can read in Canon 1 of the Council of Toledo. So that brings me to another question, the role of the laity in Christian antiquity. What was the laity? What can we understand on lay people? A first look at the Lexicon of Theologie and Kirche, our German dictionary of theology and church, gives us an insight in the etiology of the word layman. The layman is derived from the Greek laos and means something like belonging to the people. St. Jerome derived the term layman from the Greek laos, people. In the early church, the faithful who called themselves by the appellation saints had an important social significance. They were the Christian whose ethical lives reflected that, what we can read in the letter of Diognete, but who did not differ from their fellow citizens, either by reason of their place of origin, or language, or manner of life. They were the loyal subjects of the empire, whose exemplary conduct was used by the apologists of the 1st century to demand justice. They were the pioneers of apostolic expansion, of whom Tertullian could speak proudly, "We are of yesterday and already fill the whole empire with us." That's a word, a citation of Tertullian. Noteworthy, the great historian in German language, Hans Erich Feine, he spoke from Charisma der Geistbegabten, and he had a criticism of that the clergy had the spirit to lead the church, and thus lay people were excluded from it, which he understood as a momentous turns of events. And he also contrasts this with the charism of those gifted with the Spirit, Charisma der Geistbegabten. This is an understandable but ultimately unjustified criticism, since the need of administration or even an adequate structure demanded a different arrangement. And with the years of growth of the church and in opposition to the heretical movements of the time, had to be appropriately ordered and secured. You can see the governing bodies of the early period very likely showing organic development in terms of their composition. There's another Michael Schmökel, who points out that the presbytery was a consultative body whose precursor institution was probably the lower clergy, the diocese, in analogy to the Roman Senate as a decision-making body for the empire. He sees there, Matthias Schmökel, some parallels. At first, it included not only ordained members of the clergy, but also other individuals such as women, interesting women, and widows. But already the first letter of Clement insinuated that the bishops acted as directors of the Eucharist, and that this state was divorced from the laity as a separate one. The first letter of Clement is seen as one of the earliest sources of law in the history of canon law. It is remarkable that the part of the laity turned to asceticism and monasticism. At this point, a discrepancy with the theology of Paul should be mentioned, who for all the apostolic authority he claimed, nevertheless understood the church as the body of Christ, soma Christou in Greek, soma Christou, without hierarchical gradation. The great leap, the great point, we can say point of development in church history of this time was the Milan Agreement of 313. With the Constantinian turn, the laity and the clergy were granted specific rights by the state. Examples would be the right to celebrate, for instance, Sundays for the laity. It was possible to have repose on Sunday, and also the exemption from property tax or the exemption from civil offices for the clergy. That was something really new with the Milan Agreement, who came valid then. And St. Augustine, the bishop, for him, with St. Augustine, ordination acquired this typical form of character in the lebilis, whereby the clergy was entirely in the hands of the bishop, entirely. On the one hand, this determines the affiliation to the ordained bishop. On the other hand, the condition of the clergy's provision is already clearly revealed here. So we have the situation that from the Council of Chalcedon 451 onwards, the principle was established that ordinations may only be to a specific church office, therefore only at the same time as an appointment, in order to avoid the typical absolute ordinations. You know, such ordinations, the absolute ordinations, were common in the Iro-Scottish area at that time. In contrast to the previous paragraph, internal canon law is consolidated here in the sense of a legal order of the church itself, and I wanted to show you this with some practical things from the early period of Christendom. Now we make a step further and we come to the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages. From the middle of the 6th century, a process developed that led to the establishment of the great big Christian Middle Age, the Christian society. Two factors contributed decisively to this phenomenon, which defined the spiritual profile of Western Europeans for many centuries. On one hand, there was the penetration of Christianity into the rural areas outside the cities, rural areas, and the conversion of the popular masses, who constitute, demographically speaking, the vast majority portion of the European population. And these were lay people. These lay people, they were members of Latin, Germanic Christian societies. They were the ones that the church legislator of medieval Christendom had to deal with. The judgment that was given to the laity by this legislator was very much conditioned by the monastic clerical mentality dominant at the time. So you can find, for example, one point was very, very important is the decree of Gratianus. Gratianus wrote in the Distinctio 62, the people must not lead, but follow. The people must not lead, but follow. Which takes up a principle already enunciated several centuries ago by Pope Celestine I. The people must be instructed, not followed. The duty of teaching the laity and helping them to be faithful to the Christian life fell as much to the hierarchy of the church as also to the secular authority, which usually went along with its directives. This was the function of certain church capitulas in France in the Carolingian times, to impose not only as a religious precept, but also as a civil obligation, the baptism of children, religious instruction, Sunday rest, attendance at Mass, on days of obligation, Easter communion, etc., etc. The permanent concern of Christian policy was the protection of the faith of the people. Particular suspicion was aroused by the lay preachers, who proliferated in the heterodox circles of the popular heresies of the Middle Ages. The Patarians, for example, the Cathars, the Valdesians, and so on. This sense of suspicion towards the laity on the part of the church hierarchy reached its peak when, at the beginning of the late Middle Ages, the so-called esprit laïque, the lay spirit, began to undermine the very foundations of the edifice of Christianity. A famous expression of this mistrust and suspicion comes from the word of Pope Boniface VIII, who began the Decretal Clericus Laicos from 1296 with these words that sound like a statement of principle. It's a citation. Antiquity teaches us that the laity have always been hostile towards clerics. And present experience confirms this to us to the point of satiety. It's a very hard word in this citation of the Decretale Clericis Laicos. It was not until the so-called Gregorian reform, following the ideals of the pseudo-Isidoric decrees, that the actual separation of the clergy from the lay world was realized. From Pope Innocent III onwards, we record a clear separation of the higher and the lower orders, the former including the subdiaconate. The higher ordinations had a sacramental character, were separated from the lower ones. It was interesting to note that the lower ordinations could be granted absolutely. Also, in effect, this only affected the episcopate. This was quite common in the Irish-Scottish lands, as I just mentioned. With Pope Gregory VII and Pope Urban II, the prohibition of simony and the precept of celibacy were strengthened. The Second Lateran Council in the 12th century declared marriages for the higher orders null and void, whereas those concluded for the lower orders only led to the loss of the benefices. An important historical development affecting the clerical order was the so-called Eigenkirchensystem, which was derived from Germanic legal thinking. The background to this was the feudal system, which persisted in Germany until the 19th century. And this meant that lay people had a share in churches and in the church offices associated with them or in their allocation. According to Ulrich Strutz, another famous historian of church law, a church of one's own was also economically interesting for the landlord. Indeed, he said, perhaps the most advantageous capital investment of the early Middle Ages, so it brought a lot of money. At the transition from the 11th to the 12th century, there was an increased demand on the part of the church for the transfer of ownership of churches in order to ultimately break lay rule. However, monasteries and bishops, you have to think on the monastery of Cluny, also founded their Eigenkirchen, their proper churches. The most significant example of the conflict between the laity and their influence on the clergy was probably the investiture dispute, Investiturstreit. The solution to which was ultimately the Concordat of Worms of 1122, through free canonical election by the clergy and the people, followed by investiture by the king with ring and staff and subsequent consecration as bishop. The origins of the investiture by the ruler can be found in the East Franconian region at the beginning of the 10th century, in the West Franconian region somewhat later. I think this point is very important to underline. The Wormser Concordat marked the greatest divorce of clergy and laity of the time in the Middle Ages. Also, the laity remained a class in the church. The church finally succeeded in being mistress in its own house. And one can now speak of a papal church ruled by a monarchy, and at the same time, however, of a first legal separation of church and state, like it underlined the famous Viennese historian of great commemoration, Willibald Blöchel, who wrote this in his book Geschichte des kanonischen Rechts, History of Canon Law. This was to be mentioned. The Concordat of Worms, now we stay 900 years ago, the investiture controversy ended, and last 25th of September in Germany, a service with the Bishop of Mainz, appointed by Pope Francis, but invested without a sceptre due to the lack of an imperial, and also the Apostolic Nuncio of Germany, they were in the Worms Cathedral commemorating this event 900 years ago. And the keynote speech was given by the Federal Constitutional Court Judge Paul Kirchhoff, who is a notable Staatskirchenrechtler in Germany. And they were emphasizing the legal component of the document, so I underline the Wormser Concordat is really very important to understand it. Let's have a look further. The Council of Trent. From my own point of view, the Council of Trent probably represents the most important point in the history of the Catholic Church and its legal developments. One can hardly speak of such a comprehensive change and influence on the order of the Church and the Second Vatican Council. On the other hand, the Council of Trent was a response to Luther's Reformation. But Carlo Fantabier, an Italian historian, also underlined it in his books. Especially the laity, now mentioned here in passing, was concerned, for example, with the legal safeguarding of the sacrament of marriage, with which the decree Dam Etsi permitted marriage only in facie ecclesiae, also in the church. In summary, the Council of Trent was intended to secure and regulate the faith of the time and to protect it from heretics. Some personal, coming from Austria, I have to mention it. There was under Joseph II, our imperator, also very important to say that the Church had very important changes there. There was the religious fund, and at the same time under Joseph II, pastoral care was improved by establishing numerous new parishes. In addition, general seminaries for the training of clergy were found under state leadership. The state had a hand over the education in the seminaries. And these were to educate the clergy in perfect uniformity, according to principles aimed at the best of the state. The essential keyword of these Josephinian reforms was usefulness. It should be useful for the state. The negative connotation, we can go further, of the laity was in fact the effect of a slow evolutionary process that started in the Middle Ages when we look at the first code of 1917, the First Vatican Council, and also the code of 1917. What happened there? As a result, the laity in the 1917 Benedictine Code was considered almost as, the laity was considered as inferior Christians, essentially lacking legal capacity. Their ecclesiastical task, the task in the church, in fact, were very limited, and rather than being subjects of responsibility and action, they were considered mere objects of the ministerial activity of clerics. That completely changed. I cannot introduce some special things, but we can go on the next slide. That changed in the development with the Second Vatican Council, you know, to the laity in Lumen Gentium number 31. To the laity, it is their proper vocation to seek the kingdom of God, handling and ordering temporal affairs according to God. The current Code of Canon Law, after enunciating the duties and rights of all the faithful, sets out the specific duties and rights of the laity. So that was a real big change, a Paradigmenwechsel, a change of paradigm. The Second Vatican Council transformed centralism to the extent that lay rights were changed from the familiar legislative quality, in the sense of legal reception. The lay should only make legal reception, to a participatory legal position. So, the Second Vatican Council, the baptized people can participate, have a legal position, their own legal position. And the laity was given a specific dignity by the constitutions of the Council and by the Code of 1983 that followed later. Let's have an outlook in some points. There are 3 points for me very important to mention. What is affirmed in Principles and Criteria number 5 and disposed of in Article 15 of the Apostolic Constitution Predicate Evangelium finds its foundation first of all in the canons 208 and 204, paragraph 1 of the recent Codex, which assume the conciliar doctrine, Lumen Gentium 31a, equality between all the baptized in dignity and action, together with different juridical conditions. This fundamental equality, albeit in differentiation and complementarity, founds synodality and also indicates that the power of jurisdiction or governance in the Church does not come from the sacrament of order, but from the canonical mission, like understood from Pope Francis. The two powers therefore have a different source. The power of order is conferred through the sacrament, while the power of jurisdiction is attached to the office, conferred through the canonical mission, like it says Canon 146. In this sense, the Second Vatican Council states that the sacrament of orders grants the tria munera of teaching, sanctifying, and governing, but not the corresponding power. We can see it on the lay situation. Canon 129, paragraph 1, declares that qualified for the power of governance are those who are ordained in holy orders. And in paragraph 2, it adds that the lay faithful may cooperate, cooperari possunt in Latin, in exercising the same power. To cooperate properly means to work together with another. In this cooperation, each one contributes his or her part to accomplish the same work. Cooperating in the exercise of governmental power, therefore, means exercising the same power as the one with whom one cooperates. This presupposes that the person who cooperates in the exercise of governmental power has the same power. Thus, the Latin expression cooperari possunt has the same meaning as partem habere possunt. Canon 274, paragraph 1 states that only clerics can obtain of offices the exercise of which requires the power of order or the power of ecclesiastical government. The rule, therefore, does not deny the ability of the laity to have the power of governance, but limits it to offices that require neither the power of order nor that of church governance. This clarifies the criterion for Pope Francis for determining which dicasteries on the Roman Curia and or bodies of the Roman Curia may be presided over by a lay faithful. So that's the discussion that lay people can lead also dicasteries in Rome. It's a very actual question. Second point of the overlook, we can go ahead. We need in our church, I suppose, in the future there will be a need for more systems to influence and correct. However, due to the current law and also in view of the dogmatic background, a complaint or even criticism of clerics and lay people in church offices is only possible to a limited extent, you know it. If it is done informally, the prospect of change depends primarily on the insight of the criticized, if he accepts the criticism on his shoulders, provided the criticism is justified or more concretely, factually correct. There is no doubt that influence in the area of parish governance has increased. You can see it in our parishes. But there is a lot of problems on that. Canon law nowadays must develop an appropriate framework, especially at the level of administrative law and administrative jurisdiction, in the sense of a system like we know it as checks and balances, which is also impossible to escape today. You know that in 1982, the last draft of the last Schema 1982 was submitted to the legislator, to the Holy Pope John Paul II. And they decided to work on the Schema canon by canon with a special group of canonists chosen by him personally at that time. And the final phase of the preparatory work was the consultation of a group of 4 councillors of bishops appointed by the Pope. And in this last phase, the deletion of the provisions on administrative tribunals took place in a way that was completely unpredictable from the outside of this group. One of the most ambitious projects of the post-conciliar canon law reform came in this way to an end. And there are no administrative tribunals on a particular, on particular church level. In the light of the renewed discussion, the questions now arises, a new one, and we will see how it will end. It is not yet foreseeable what decisions will be taken in Germany, who has, you know, Germany has a big tradition on it, within the framework of the synodaler Weg, synodal path. The credible proclamation of the gospel has suffered massive damage as a result of the sexual abuse by clergy that has become known in recent years, and the way the church authorities have dealt with this scandal. It would be too little and ultimately no more than a powerless adjustment of opinion through external pressure. If this were the only reason to turn to the ambitious project of a church administrative jurisdiction and the tribunals on the level of particular churches. The urgent strengthening of the authority of the bishops as autonomous shepherds of the particular church in the succession of the apostles can probably not be achieved by new legal remedies alone. However, the improvement in the protection of the subjective rights of those persons subject to the law already called for in the principles of the code reform should be extended in legal culture in our church. I come to my concluding remarks. It remains the task of canon law, I suppose, on the basis of past experience to drive forward developments which, while at the same time always referring to the universal church, also make solutions possible on a particular legal level in dioceses or also on the continents. The history of canon law, as I tried to show you, shows parallel developments within the Roman Church as well as in connection with the Eastern Church traditions, which are basically feasible. While preserving the hierarchy of leadership and teaching office, a Catholic diversity in the question of the legal and social nature of ministers would be quite conceivable. My remarks were also intended to show that since the beginnings of the Church, there have been considerations of regulating church life and ultimately also the life of specific office of clergy. Thus, there was the question of moral claims, but also the question of education and training. The latter always had to flow into missionary activity, into preaching, certainly also due to apologetic necessities, but ultimately also to raise the quality in pastoral care and in the fundamental conduct of ministry. Thus, the Church will also in the future have to exercise a balancing act between freedom of expression and teaching and order in the hierarchy, or perhaps in a synodal structure for which an adequate canonical framework must be created. Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. And now I think that unfortunately Professor Andrea Favoro from Faculty of Canon Law, San Pio X in Venice. Unfortunately, he cannot participate in the conference because of health problems. We are really sorry. So now we can swiftly turn to the questions. So, do we have any questions? You can ask the question on chat if you're online. I have one question.
Okay.
So, what for you are the borders, like where is the borderline where clergy cannot, where are the lines where there is a materia in which clergy cannot give everything to the lay people. For example, in Poland, the matter of lay women who give Holy Communion is quite controversial, and many people say that it's not traditional. So, where do you see the borders of this merging with lay people, and how can you see this topic?
Yeah, I think sometimes we have in our common world different problems. I think the Second Vatican Council was a great opportunity to open the minds in our church and to give more participation to the lay people, as I mentioned it. The specific role of women in the church, we are now in a period in the 21st century where we see where many women also participate in our common life, in our parishes. They are present, they want to do something active, they want to participate also exercising the ministry from the common ground of the baptism. In some nations it's different, like in Poland it's different, because there are different traditions who lead to the fact that some institutions are more developed than others, or not. If you see the permanent diaconate, for example, in our German tradition we have a lot of permanent diacons who are married and who work in the parishes. They do a good job. They are involved in the pastoral care of many souls with their families. And I think also the women have a very, very important task, and the Pope Francis, the Spiritus Domini, wanted to show that the ministries of Accolade and also of the lectorate officially are open now, because like you see in different countries, I think also in America Latina, in Latin America, he came from this field that where there are no ministers, no priests, with a long distance to one parish to the next, Amazonia, for example. They are lay people in education, teaching pupils, and so on. They can also be a good catechist who has the right to help in the liturgy or to distribute the Holy Communion, for example. Why should it be forbidden for that? Pope Francis opened it a bit more, and you know that we are also observed as a church from outside to open our minds, to get more participation of lay people inside the church. That is a consequence of the Second Vatican Council. And in some regions, in some countries, it is more developed, and in other it is to be developed. But that's a cultural question, and everyone has his culture and form of participation. So I think it is useful, it is possible now because it's on the regulation with a motu proprio, and this is allowed now, officially allowed. And if a bishop conference says we will introduce it, why not? it's possible.
And thank you very much. Any other questions? I don't see any, so
So thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
so